At first glance, it might seem strange for a British naval historian to spend quite as much time on the US Civil War as I do. Well, there are three reasons for this. One, it's a very interesting war. It's in many ways the first modern war, and therefore it's worthy of study. Two, I used to teach it a bit at King's and various other universities where I have been. I have usually used the US Civil War as a good example to go back to because there's a lot of sources. There's a lot of sources. And so you can give it to students and they can have a really fun time and they can find lots of information to argue pretty much every way till the sun goes down. And that gives them a lot of place to practice skills, to develop their skills. But mostly, I would say it owes itself to the fact that when I was a first year PhD student at King's, I volunteered in a program in schools, going in and teaching after school history club. And there were some students I was teaching who, well, let's put it this way, their school didn't have a single historian on their team teaching humanities. In fact, most of them had degrees in English, not degrees in history, geography, or any of the other humanities. But they were doing their best. There's always a shortage of people with the right skills at certain schools, and this was one of those inner city schools where, frankly, it got a bad rep, and there were always people worried about going there. I never had any problems there. Maybe I was big enough and scary enough I didn't have problems, I don't know, but I never had any problems. And I basically had a deal with them in that they were happy to teach the British history sections of the course. But whilst I was supposed to be there running an after school club, what I really did was teach the A-level US Civil War. Because they couldn't teach it. They didn't have the knowledge and the background knowledge experience to make sense. They could go look at the books and they go, well, this is what's in the exam modules, this is what we need. But it wasn't really their forte. So I did it. And so, for an academic year, I taught a whole lot of students A-level US Civil War. And I had them doing the things, doing sort of little plays in funny voices and everything else they could to drum home the lessons, to make sure they had as much information at their fingertips as possible. And it was a lot of fun for me. It's always really fun when you get a headmaster of a school wander in and go, there are kids in here who I haven't seen turn up to a lesson all year. They're turning up to your after school club. That headmaster didn't mind it. The next one did object to the fact that the after school club got more attention than the classes did. Hence the program ended, but we'll leave that to one side. That was a lot of fun. And so whenever I teach the US Civil War, I remember that. And I have to say I was naughty because one of the things you, as a historian, you learn very quickly is you learn where to go to find reviews of books and what books are good and what books are not good. And the thing about it was I tended to use Bruce Catton's trilogy. And I use Bruce Catton's trilogy not because it is the best in terms of the facts in it, not because it is the best in terms of its how to put it, up-to-date nature and the fullest of research. No, I used it because it's the absolute best I've found the trilogy in terms of books that provide the story of the war, the narrative, the rhythm of the American Civil War. And I know there are lots of people who have different views on this, and I accept we are going to have different views because we come from different perspectives. But for teaching A-level students, that is 16, 17, 18-year-olds, I found the pace in this really helpful. The fact that the trilogy also sort of fit with the term layout and allowed me to concentrate on one term on the pre-war on some pre-war build up to war, next book on and sort of things, and the fact that it was relatively cheap, so much so that most of the kids actually went and bought themselves copies of the trilogy. It's when a student comes to you and they go, yeah, we also bought a bookshelf. What? Well, it was the first time I had books. I didn't have a bookshelf in my room. And my mum was so worried about me damaging the books, she insisted on me buying a bookshelf. I want to think about those students sometimes, and I wonder if they're still reading these books, if they still use them, and what they've gone on to. But I hope I gave them a year of very interesting history on the American Civil War. And that's why I like returning to it as a topic, because it has very good memories for me. Although I'm fairly sure the participants did not enjoy it anywhere nearly so much. And this topic tonight is one which can look, on the face of it, very strange for a naval historian to talk about, but actually it goes right to the heart of the rhythm of war. It's all about logistics. The whole of the Chattanooga campaign is logistics. It's all about supply and logistics and who has controlled the key supply points where the rivers meet the rails. Because that is the key supply points. Wagon trains are terrible things to try and be supplied by. Atrocious things. They'll ruin roads, what roads there are. No, it's railways and rivers. They're what keep you going in the American Civil War. They're also arguably what keep you going in the First World War. And when we start to look at, well, World War II, you notice a small pattern starting to turn up when it's talking about the movement of large volumes of goods. Because roads, they're good for the last mile. They are necessary for the last mile. But it's the first 300 miles that matter. Because if you can't get it there, then it doesn't matter how efficient your organization is for the last mile, it ain't getting anywhere. And similarly, there's no point in being able to get it 300 miles if you can't get the last mile. You're relying on, again, wagon trains, horse-pulled wagons to move your equipment around. That's just not good. So, Chattanooga is in 1863. And the US Civil War, by this point, has been raging for, well, 2 years. Why? Why has this war come about? Well, slavery was certainly a factor. Economics was a factor, but I'd also say there's a big factor is culture. And the approach to governance that the northern states had versus the southern states. To an extent, the southern states, and this is one of the problems you have throughout the Confederacy during the Civil War, believed that the states should dictate to the government, to the federal government. The state should be able to basically invert the pyramid when they wanted. The northern states, to a sort of extent, felt that there were areas of competency. There are areas where it's the federal government's job to take charge, and there are areas where it's the state to take charge. And those can sound not that dissimilar, because neither side feels that the federal government should have overall complete and utter control. No, neither side does. But there's a big difference between believing the state should be able to tell the federal government what they want to do whenever they want to do it, and basically the federal government has to get out the way, than, well, actually, no, you now have gone into the federal government's competency. So this is their area, this is our area. One sort of demarcation system. We can go along in parallel, but we shall never meet because we do not get interfere in the same areas. And the other one is, now I want to be in this area, so you have to get out. See the problem? Now, of course, since World War II especially, there has been a massive expansion in the federal government in the United States, but there's also been a realization amongst everyone since World War II, really, with governments that if you expect governments to do more, if you're going to blame them for things going wrong more often in different areas, then they're going to need to expand to deal with it. The one thing a politician can never seem to do in a circumstance is go, sorry, we're not responsible for that. It would be refreshing if a politician did, but they're never going to. Because the moment they do that, they A, admit that they lack power, and B, they might be made fun of on television. And that's the quickest way to lose elections, to be a source of amusement. To be laughed at. In theory. In practice, it's problematic when a group tries to laugh at some person, make them the butt of jokes, and everyone else is in it looking at them going, but that makes sense. And theoretically, I suppose if a politician did say, sorry, that's not our area of specialism, that's not what we do, the government doesn't have anything to do with that, maybe they get the respect. Maybe. It's a weird situation. But the US Civil War starts because of this brinkmanship. Because of this division in understanding of what the nature of government was and is. And in some regards, it also fell apart because when you've put sovereignty in a document like the Constitution, and that's really what the Americans have done, that's the advantage of a codified Constitution, you can make that the sovereign document. Yes, the people are sovereign, but that's within the bounds of the codified Constitution as enumerated in a document. Well, you can get all sorts of interesting ideas about that document. All sorts of interesting ideas about that document. Realistically, the biggest problem for the South, though, was that whereas the North inherited the structures of the federal government and was able to build upon them, the North was able to organize itself and build itself from existing structures and implement them. Expanded, but implemented. The South had to build them from scratch. And the South had to do it whilst dealing with a government structure which, at its very nature, felt that centralized power was the antithesis of it. And that's a problem. That is a massive problem. But the war had waged on. It was always interesting. It was always more active in the West, in many respects, than the East. The East seems to attract generals like McClellan, who... McClellan almost seems to me like he thinks he's a Greek general fighting for a Greek city-state against another Greek city-state where they're going to have a punch-up and then a negotiation afterwards. And depending on how the punch-up goes, depends on who gets most say and what's the solution afterwards. He doesn't seem to understand that he's actually in a war. And this, again, is not unusual in civil wars. You often get people who think, well, they're my neighbours. We're going to end up living next to each other soon. We don't want to do too much damage. And they don't want to do too much damage to us because we're going to sort this all out. We're going to get around the table and sort this all out. You get others who basically are truly fighting like they're in a family. Don't know if you've ever seen it, but families tend to fight internally like cats and dogs. They will go hell for leather at each other quite happily. Externally, no. Internally, vicious tongues. But externally, it's a united front. And don't jump into it. Best advice my grandfather ever gave me, and one which I will always keep and always pass on to people, is doesn't matter who you're dating, if there's a family argument going on, you support them by supplying ice cream, hugs, and taking them out to dinner and various things to make them feel better. Don't try and fight the battles internally for them. It won't end well for you. And might well end the relationship. Just don't. Let the family sort itself out. Don't bring your own family into it. Yeah. But the trouble is with civil wars, is all that stuff which my grandfather advised me never to do if I was dating someone and there was an argument going on in their family. In civil wars, all that happens. Everyone does pile in. All the distant relatives. Everyone comes in from all the different families. And oh my lord, does that create trouble. It really does. Now, the war in the West had done well under Holonek, but then he'd been invited back to try and run the army and trying to solve the McClellan problem. Eventually he does solve the McClellan problem by getting rid of McClellan, but, these things happen. But it does mean at various points you have Grant, you have others taking different leads. And one of the best examples of this, and this is the forerunner to our program, is General William S. Rosecrans, who is a really intriguing character. Old Rosie. He truly is an intriguing character. Because in some ways the war breaks him. And Chickamauga, the Battle of Chickamauga is a good example. It breaks him physically and mentally. It does. And that leads to him getting removed. But prior to that, he's been having a fairly successful time kicking around Braxton Bragg, who's the Confederate general, and a few others around the west of the United States. Chattanooga, where we're talking about, is a vital rail hub and river hub. It's got lines going north towards Asheville and Knoxville. It's got important manufacturing facilities itself. It's got iron, coal, and the river hub, it's got the Tennessee River, which is navigable at this point. That's important. A navigable river means you can take boats up and down it. Shallow draft, but boats you can take up and down it. And so it's a really critical point. You've got vital railroads going through it. You've got a vital river going through it. This is the kind of space which you want to take and hold, because it is what allows you to open up other spaces and supply other spaces. Or if you hold it, you've denied the access to movement up and down the river or across the railways to your opponents. Now, Rosecrans had managed to get Braxton Bragg, who's a Confederate general he's opposing, and his Army of Tennessee to abandon Chattanooga and withdraw into northern Georgia. He was using his Army of Cumberland for this. A very well-named army, and, well, it doesn't hurt that, frankly, the army is well-led. It not just has Rosecrans, it also has General Thomas, who I'll be talking about in a bit. It has good officers in it. Very good officers. Its previous commander, Buell, hadn't been as good. He has many, many issues, but he's kind of like McClellan. Most of his issues stem from the fact of their perception of what winning looks like in this war. Always a problem. It's their perception on the northern side is the perception of what winning looks like. With the Confederates, the trouble is they all have different ways of how to get there, and all sure they're right, everyone else is wrong, and spend their time fighting each other over it. But we'll talk about that one in a bit, because there is whole slides on the issues the Confederates were having with their command structure. They basically have favourite hobbies, and they're not to do with actually carrying out military operations. Well, Rosecrans managed to pursue Bragg, and the armies collided at the Battle of Chickamauga on the September the 19th to 20th, 1863. Now, Bragg managed to achieve victory where a poorly worded instructions to a general from Rosecrans that he was basically supposed to draw the lines together, meant he, instead of drawing lines together, moved his division to go and support another division behind it, which opened up a massive gap. And despite General Thomas II in command of the army, managing to do a massively skilled defensive stand, which I don't actually the name of the Rock of Chickamauga, which is quite a cool name to be. Let's be honest, Rock of Chickamauga, Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga. Yeah. Rosecrans' army is forced to retreat to Chattanooga. Rosecrans is damaged in the attack, and also he feels personally responsible for the loss. He's been trading on his nerves. He's been gambling and gambling and gambling at various points to try and push things forward aggressively. And this time he gambled too far and he's made a mistake and he's got a lot of good people killed. And, well, Roscoe's falls apart. He does. He tries to do things. He keeps trying to push himself to do things, but he is doing his best as well to try and deal with his own issues, and his own issues have come to a fore in this front. And so he's relying on Thomas to run the front. And in previous battles, it had often made a difference when he charged the front because he had been so personally inspiring people. And it's... how do I put it? It's a classic situation. You can only push yourself so far. You can only push your luck so far. You can only push your soul so far. You can only make so many withdrawals from the bank of courage before your body, your mind, everything is spent. And in this case, I'd say Rosecrans was spent. He's pushed himself too hard and too far. And it comes through. And very quickly, as he's withdrawing and Bragg's deciding to besiege him, and I'll get into the reason why Bragg chooses to besiege rather than attack, well, Lincoln and other Stanton, the war secretary, pick up on this. And the reserves start to flow in the direction of Chattanooga. And very quickly, other things start to roll in the direction of Chattanooga. And frankly, I think Braxton Bragg might well be ruining the day that he made such a successful attack on Rosecrans at the Battle of Chickamauga. Because frankly, his life was about to get infinitely worse. Infinitely worse. But with that being said, shameless book plug! I know, it's a bit weird. Why do I do a shameless book plug in every video? Well, there's two reasons. One, honestly, it gives me an opportunity to say thank you to everyone for supporting the channel and helping it grow, helping it develop, and helping it keep going. You pay for all my research, you pay for me to basically be a naval historian. My work pays me to live, this pays me to actually do what I want to do to live. It's great fun. And, as an academic in the UK, well, we only get promoted if we sell books. And at the moment, this is the only one I have, so it's a shameless book plug. But hopefully there'll be more soon. Hopefully there'll be more soon. Although, that's going to depend on how the Historiathon went for over the last couple of days. Because let's be honest, this video is supposed to be coming out the day after I have finished a 36-hour live stream, which is going to be broken up into 4 9-hour live streams on YouTube and a single 36-hour constant stream on Twitch. Hence, I'm recording this over 2 weeks in advance. I'm not stupid, I know. I realized today, at this time, I am probably still... I'm probably awake, knowing me, because of the functioning insomnia. I am probably sitting with the poodle, reading a book, possibly with some music playing, and just enjoying not having to speak for a bit, because I've been speaking non-stop for 36 hours. Lord help me and my voice. But thank you very much for making it all possible. Thank you for being there, and thank you for your support of the channel. Now, almost as soon as the news started flooding in, the North starts reacting. And the North's reaction is very simple. They want to send out someone to take over, someone to take charge, and someone to deal with the situation. They start off by sending Hooker, who's Major General Hooker, to bring his corps with 20,000 troops from the Army of Pontiac to Virginia, and Army Pontiac in Virginia to there to reinforce. And they also message Grant to send William T. Sherman, his deputy in command, his second in command, with another corps to go. And then on September 29th, they order Grant to go to Chattanooga himself. And very key, they say they're creating the military division of the Mississippi, which is going to bring all the territory from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River, and most of Arkansas, honestly, under a single commander for the first time. And Grant is given the option for replacing Rosecrans with Thomas if he thinks Rosecrans can't do it. Now, the thing is, Grant had previously determined he didn't have really good relationships with either Thomas or Rosecrans, but he felt that he couldn't get Rosecrans to do what he wished as a subordinate. So Grant pretty much plans to select Thomas automatically when he gets reaches there and reaches the Army of Cumberland. But he does wait till he gets there to do it. He is worried, though, about Rosecrans' mentality and whether Rosecrans has the confidence to hold it, and actually sends a telegraph to Thomas. Hold Chattanooga at all hazards. I'll be there as soon as possible. And Thomas, beginning to him second, responds, I will hold the town till we starve. And with the Rock of Chickamauga, you know that's the case. Grant still took about a month to get there. He was dispatched on 29th of September. He doesn't get there till the 23rd of October. It's a month pretty much journey to get there. Now, at the same time, Braxton Bragg here, well, he just managed to win a victory. He should have been basking in the joy of it. Nope, no, he's not. Instead, he's dealing with subordinates causing problems and trying to decide what to do. And when I say he's dealing with subordinates causing trouble, this poor man is going grey because of his subordinates. There's a list of them. And they either didn't do what he was supposed to, or didn't do what he requested them to do, and then there's some of them who are actually petitioning to get him removed. Well, that ends up with a typical Confederate solution having to take place. But it's interesting to note that in the Union forces, Lincoln and Stanton have basically just said, right then, we're making Grant the overboss for this area. We're not coming out ourselves. We're making Grant the overboss, and we're leaving decisions to him. And they know Grant will make decisions. And Grant is actually making decisions based more on who he can work with and who will work with him properly into his mind than anything else. You could argue, to an effect, it's his decision to get rid of Rosecrans which drives the knife into Rosecrans' back. But one of the fun things is that they actually do meet up on a train journey. And Rosecrans does explain to Grant exactly what he was going to do, what his plans were, and Grant's main question is, why the frigate were you doing them? Grant doesn't understand, because if he'd been doing them, he doesn't think Rosecrans would be replaced. The honest answer is that the thing was going to be created, the organisation was going to be created, whatever happened. The question was who was going to be put in charge of it. And it was probably going to be Grant, because he was proven the most successful, but the thing is, if Rosecrans had still been popular and successful, had still been winning, and had still been his full force when it was formed, then Grant might have actually might not have been able to pick Sherman as his deputy in command. He might have wanted Sherman as deputy in command, but Rosecrans could well have been the one which he was told he had to be. But yes, it is a nightmare. And all the while, the Confederates are starting to blockade and try and besiege the Union defenders in the town of Chattanooga, and, well, it's going to sound strange, but this is the worst position to be in, honestly, for the Confederates. Because their army's now fixed. This is the trouble with doing a siege when you're consistently the smaller army. Yay, you're doing a siege. Yes, you've got this chunk of the enemy surrounded, and you are besieging them. Oh, dang, that means you're stuck in this place whilst the enemy sends in reinforcements. And they're going to be sending a lot of reinforcements. A lot of reinforcements. As mentioned, there's 20,000 on direction on the Hooker, who's coming as fast as he can. About not much different is coming under Sherman, who is bringing a solid core with him. And other reinforcements are also being rushed there. It's just, it's not good. It's not good. And it gets worse when we consider that when we consider the Union command changes that are going to come out of this. Because here's the Rock, George Thomas, finally getting command of the Army of the Cumberland. He almost had it before Rosecrans took command of it, but Rosecrans was senior, and frankly, he turned it down before when Buell had been offered it. Sherman, well, yeah. Sherman permanently looks like the man you least want to have an argument with. Because he looks, honestly, like you imagine Ernest J. King constantly look. Permanently angry. And then we have Hooker. Hooker is an intriguing soul. He truly is. He's actually one of the better generals, I'd argue, on the Union side. But the trouble is, he never feels he gets enough recognition. You give him one line of praise, he deserves a paragraph. You give him a paragraph of certainty and honesty, he thinks he deserves an entire report. And he always thinks he deserves to be the next rank up. Which creates problems for those in charge of him. And creates problems in his working relationship with Grant. Whereas Thomas is in many ways the unsung and forgotten hero of the Civil War, especially of the Union armies, Hooker has become in many ways a byword for drinking and gambling and all sorts of things in his headquarters, when realistically there seems to be not as much of a case for it. No one's been able to prove that he was ever actually drunk while in command. With Sherman, no one's ever been able to prove that he was in a good mood, an actual positive good mood when he was in command. But that's a different matter. It's rumoured he did smile on occasion. It's rumoured he smiled on occasion. It's just we're having trouble finding that smile, that change. And so, yeah, Military Division of the Mississippi. Grant's now got 3 very solid commanders below him. Very solid commanders. Who are capable of being very aggressive. And the thing is, not one of these 3 is going to do to him what Braxton Bragg's commanders regularly do to him. This poor man has to go out to actually deal with the issues. Yes, this is President Davis, who arguably would have possibly better served the Confederacy as a general, but then that would just add another general who would be playing politics half the time rather than commanding his troops into the Confederacy. And frankly, the last thing they needed was another of those. For an organisation which prides itself on inheriting military traditions and martial prowess, by golly, do they not know how to actually run a decent chain of command. Then they're involved in their favourite pastime, whilst the Union troops are having plenty of time to reorganise under new commanders, get themselves fed, get themselves watered, work out how to break the siege so they can get supplies and all these things. Yeah, the Union and the Confederates, in contrast, are, well, Bragg is trying to fire two people. I've already discussed that, but I feel like I need to mention them by name. That's Thomas C. Hidman, Major General, who failed to destroy a part of the Union Army when he was instructed to, and Lieutenant General Leonidas Polk. Polk, of course, being his own interesting gentleman, who had not attacked on the 20th September at Chickamauga. Well, not attacked at the time he was supposed to. And he relieves them of command because he's disappointed them. At which point, another 12 of his most senior generals sent a petition to Jefferson Davis demanding Bragg be relieved of command. At which point, Davis comes to visit, decides that, frankly, no, Bragg is doing an okay job, I'm going to leave him in charge, and Bragg turns around by retaliating against those officers who plotted against him, by relieving Lieutenant General D.H. Hill and Major General Simon B. Buckner. There's no wonder he couldn't order an attack or do more than a loose siege at this point. Because, frankly, I'm surprised if anyone in the army knows he's friggin' in charge of them. Look, I realise this goes against the grain and you're not supposed to touch this particular third rail on YouTube, but I'm going to say it now. The Confederates probably have as good a fighting soldiers as the Union. They're probably equal. But in terms of command structure, the Confederates spend way more time arguing about it in every theatre. Admittedly, usually people then point out and go, well, what about the Army of the Potomac? What about, McClellan's force, etc.? And I go, yes! They were also riven by politics, which is why they caused so much trouble. But pretty much the rest of the armies seem to do pretty darn well. There are some issues with some of them, but broadly speaking, things are dealt with quite quickly to get things working, and to make the economy work, and to make the army work. And it's very rare that Lincoln never has to go out to the further armies to deal with problems. He has to go and visit General McClellan on occasion, but I know I keep bringing up McClellan, but he's really a special soul, because he's one of those great ones, again, for why this is so good to discuss with students and to put them down, because you can put down his letter about events. Let's say he meets the president and what he takes from that meeting, and you can put the letter about what the president says to someone else about his recollections of the meetings, and they look like they were in two completely different meetings. And you go, now, what happened in this meeting that these two people have remembered it completely differently? And you sit there and go, so who's right? Or were they both not listening to each other? Because McClellan's one is basically, oh, the president was so lovely about me. He said I'm so great, so amazing. And Lincoln's is basically, I went up there to give him a kick up the keister to get him to move his... And you sit there and read them go... So I'm guessing what Lincoln said was, General, you are a gifted leader, I see this. When are you going to move? And basically McClellan only hears the bit gifted leader. And Lincoln basically just thinks that, anyone else would realize that the first part is history. The next part is what I'm requiring you to do now. And McClellan's still going, he thinks I'm a gifted leader. Oh. You get these children. You do. You always do. So, basically, what's the first problem for the Union? The first problem for the Union is the cracker line, or rather opening the cracker line to break the siege. And for that, they come with some very clever little ideas. And it involves, well, the chief engineer of the Army of Cumberland, Brigadier General William Baldy Smith, who is very good at engineering, absolutely atrocious personality. Absolutely atrocious. Seems to spend most of his time starting arguments with people for no realistic reason. Grant was incredibly impressed with him and gives him promotions and things when he first arrives. Is very happy to give him the promotions. And then after working along, he goes, Oh, I now know why you weren't promoted. And they thought I was bad. What am I going to do on this one? I'm going to just give him a call and send him off to go and do some fighting. And he does that quite well. And bringing in General Hazen, who is this gentleman at the top, who has they both have very fine beards, and I have to be very careful about which one I'm focusing on, because otherwise you can't get confused by the beards. And basically the plan goes like this. Because Brown's Ferry, which was a key point of the the blockade, which was held by the Confederates. But if you controlled it, you could open a nice road and a nice river route straight to it from there, because Brown's Ferry crossed the Tennessee River from Moccasin Point. The road followed a gap in the foothills, which turns south through Lookout Valley to Wauchee Station, and then west to Kelly's Ferry, which was also a navigable point on Tennessee that could be reached by Union supply boats, things like the USS Chattanooga. And the thing is, if you can supply up the river, you can open a decent supply line. Suddenly that army, which the Union has there, instead of starving, gets well fed. And the people who start starving are the Confederates, who are at the very end of their supply lines, and who specifically are not in the supply center, that is Chattanooga. See the other problem with besieging from the perspective of the smaller force of the Confederates? Now, this meant if you could seize Brown's Ferry, link up with Hooker's force, which was coming from, Bridgeport, Alabama, through Lookout Valley, coming up the desired route, then you'd be able to set up a very nice supply line. A supply line which would provide you with all the food you need, or become known as the Cracker Line. Now, in addition, this has the added benefit of threatening the right flank of any Confederate movement into the valley, which means that you stop the Confederates being able to maneuver even more so than being a besieging force does. Oh my. So, this requires Hooker do some moving. It requires some forces from the Army of Cumberland also do some moving. And this includes Brigadier General Hazen's brigade downriver on pontoons and a raft at night, and they captured a gap in the hills on the west bank of the Tennessee, while 2nd Brigade, that's John B. Tertian's, just marched across Moccasin Point in support. Now, this operation goes very quickly, and this is where the really big problem starts to come through in the Confederate command issues, because of mostly this man. Now, welcome to one of the most divisive figures of the US Civil War, a war which is not short of divisive figures to be divisive over. But Longstreet, honestly, there are basically 2 people he likes in the entire United States of America. One of those is Lee, most of the time. The other one is Grant. Do you see the problem now? And this really starts to cause some issues, because in this scenario, the Union troops have just made it ashore. They have managed to, start setting up the movement to get the Cracker Line open, which is going to allow them to complete freedom maneuver and food supply. And it's happening in his area. His Virginians, his troops who were dispatched to strengthen Braxton Bragg, to reinforce the forces, have been given command of this area. He's one of the most reliable, officers in the army. Is the view to extent many have of him. His troops are some of the most reliable soldiers in the Confederacy, and yet, well, he ordered, whilst Longstreet had been ordered to move additional movements into Lookout Valley, Longstreet had ignored them. And when Hazen's troops floated past the Lookout Mountain and underneath the Confederates' guns, no one noticed them. At which point, by the time they are on Browns Ferry, which is in the Browns Ferry area, which is about 0500 hours, 0430 hours to 0500 hours, they're getting ashore. There's a counterattack by the 15th Alabama Infantry, led by Colonel Oates of Little Round Top, and it's repulsed. Oates is wounded. Oates' brigade commander, Brigadier General Evan Law, places the remainder of his brigade blocking the road over Lookout Mountain, and then reports all this to Longstreet. So let's see. One of my brigades has taken up a defensive position. One of my regiments did an attack and was repulsed on a formation. And Longstreet then, as all commanders would do in that situation, dismisses the report, considers the Union move to only be a feint, and doesn't bother sending on any information to Bragg. I mean, honestly, I would love to have Longstreet and Beatty in a conversation about how you treat your senior officers and how you pass on information. I think it would be illuminating to hear their opinions as to what is and what is not personal information you pass on to your senior officers. Bragg hears about this attack, and then orders Longstreet to retake the ground immediately. But Longstreet does nothing, and this gives the formation which is now sitting in Browns Ferry, General Smith's division pretty much, by this point, because, there was a brigade going down by river, a brigade marching across, and now reinforcements have also arrived, spend the day consolidating and strengthening and building defensive positions around their bridgehead without any interference. And in the afternoon, Hooker's column, those 20,000 troops, march through Lookout Valley, link up with Hazen and Turgeon at Browns Ferry at roughly 1600 hours on 20th of October. At this point, Thomas's staff, i.e. the troops in the Army of the Cumberland, which is back in Chattanooga, start to begin the preparations for the supplies coming over the Cracker Line, and he telegraphs Holneck, who's the Union general in charge of all the Union forces and the chief of staff of the army, that in a few days he expects to be pretty well supplied and all the food backlog and everything to be made up with his troops. And things start to get worse, because by this point, Longstreet has ignored not just one, not just two, not just three. We're going to go the word several, but by various means of communication, short of actually physically going there himself, but smoke signals were possibly considered, Bragg's instructions to attack Browns Ferry. And so Bragg orders him to attack Hooker's concentration at Wauhutchee instead. Now, here is where you have a problem, because Wochi looks like a great idea, because Hooker hasn't arranged his forces into very effective defensive positions. He's merely told them to take good cover for the troops and bivouac and rest up. He expects them to be moving out presently. In fact, Longstreet, when he goes and has a look at them, is amazed to see the various divisions' troops bivouacking and sleeping around with their wagon train parked directly in front of him, between him and them. However, this is where Longstreet gets a bright idea. Oh, happy days. And instead of organizing a daytime attack against this force, which is so dispersed, he decides he's going to really maximize the advantage. He's going to order a night attack against such a force. And he's only going to use the brigade of Evan the Law, that brigade which has already had a regiment mauled, and supported by Brigadier Micah Jenkins' division from the Lookout Mountain. Bragg had authorized them to use his entire force for a daylight attack. Now, you could argue that Longstreet may be playing the long game. He might be going, these men are a precious resource. I'm not gonna pass them out so willy-nilly. I'm gonna retain my troops. I'm gonna keep them safe. I'm gonna use them as best I can. And whilst I will never be an advocate for unthinking following of orders by personnel, never unthinking, there is a certain point at which it does start to seem attractive. At a certain point, I can understand why senior officers are going, it'd be so good. So good. I'd like it so much, please. The attack scheduled for 2200 hours on October the 28th. But it gets into confusion before it even begins, and it's delayed till midnight. And this is where things really start to get worse, because whilst Longstreet's going, and he's going off to try and fight General Burnside and do the job he's required to try and relieve Knoxville, which he's going to not be able to do, Bragg is getting rid of a subordinate who doesn't really help him. And in return, Grant is getting the arrival of a subordinate who really does help him. Although doesn't really help him as best he can in this battle, because Sherman arrives. And this is important, because Grant has been preparing for battles. He's had Thomas and his senior engineer Smith working together to prepare for planning an assault on Bragg and how to attack Bragg's positions. But he also refused to say, don't do anything. Nothing's going to be launched and nothing's going to be confirmed until Sherman arrives and agrees and sees land and agrees with it. Sherman basically sees land and goes, we can take that position by 9 a.m. And promptly, the normally efficient, fairly organised, quite reliable, hard-driving Sherman seems to turn into a dilettante. I do not know how. He still, broadly speaking, wins the battle, but oh my God, does he make it hard for himself. Sort of every decision he could make, he doesn't go the right way about it. And to an extent, the battle ends up getting won not even by Thomas. It gets won by Thomas's troops, which are just going, we're here. The enemy are up there. Engage the enemy more closely, I guess. There's a reason this battle is appropriate for a naval historian to be looking at. So Grant has arrived, and Sherman has arrived, and Longstreet has gone, and Bragg is looking at a completely new command structure, and with Sherman has come hardcore, a corps of veterans who have been serving Grant previously, and Hooker's here with another corps. It's just bad for Bragg all round. He's now got troops all round him. Go back to this lovely map back here. You can see the lines they're coming in from. Well, Sherman's coming in from above as well. it's not a good position for them to be in. And this is where, realistically, the fact that they haven't done much to really strengthen their positions is really going to do them a disservice. Now, the battle starts pretty much over here. Sorry I did an earlier version of this, and for some reason my hand was over here, and I was going, it's not, it's closer to me. Why am I doing that? But, so hence there's a break here, because I had to redo that bit. Over here, you can see Orchard Knob there. It's in the centre. And it's a position in which if you push forward, you are pushing the Confederates back to Missionary Ridge. You're pushing them back in the direction of what should be firm ground for them. Honestly, if you go and look at Missionary Ridge, you'd think with the time they've had there, they could have turned it into, okay, it's not the best ground in the world for defending, but with the way it is, with the time they've had, you think they could have turned it into an absolute nightmare that could be held by few against many. That would break Union armies on it. Let's be honest, for Union, they're going to keep fighting there because Chattanooga is that important as a railway point, as a railroad point, as a road point, as an absolute industrial hub in its own right. Chattanooga is that important in this period. So the Union are going to keep coming. If you create a right position, you could have broken several Union armies there. Now, at this point, on 23rd, they observe the various columns of Confederate troops marching away to go and, well, join. In this point, the important thing is to go and join Longstreet and go and join the forces going against Burnside. At this point, Thomas goes, we should disrupt this. So, with Grant's permission, he orders Brigadier General Thomas Wood to conduct a reconnaissance in force. Now, recon in force is taking a whole division forward and basically going, right then, we're going to attack anything which moves, and we're going to hopefully stir up a lot more violence than we're looking to reveal your positions. He orders him to avoid an engagement with the enemy and to return to his fortifications when the strength of the Confederate lines ascertained, when they know what they're dealing with. Again, pretty standard for reconnaissance in force. Wood's men have slightly different ideas. They assemble and, well, they notice that their objective is approximately 2,000 yards to the east. It's a small knoll. It's called Battle of Orchard Knob. It's a knob. It's a knoll. It's 100 feet high, also known as Indian Hill. And when they formed up, there was also Major General Philip Sheridan's division lined up to protect their right flank, and Howard's 11th Corps extended the line to the left. This meant there's 20,000 troops arranged in lines in front of them. Now, if you're thinking 20,000 troops, that's a reconnaissance in force and a half, you'd be right. At this point, the difference between this and an actual attack is really, really, really fine. And it gets worse, because at 13:30 hours, 14,000 of those troops move forward at double quick. And they run into the roughly 600 Confederate troops, who are able to fire a single volley before they're overrun. We're talking 23 to 1 numbers, a little bit of spare change in that. And, yeah, that's not a reconnaissance in force by that point. Surprised about this, but very happy surprises, Grant and Thomas concur on deciding to order the men to hold their position they've now achieved and entrench. And they actually moved their headquarters to Orchard Knob for the remainder of the battle, which turned out to be a very good view spotting for it. It was amazing. If there is sarcasm coming through, you're not surprised. I think the only people who believed this attack was a reconnaissance in force are the papers. Basically, it's a good thing to talk about it. It's an opening skirmish. And Grant and Thomas were prepared to play it however it turned out. If it turned out that the Confederates had all their troops in that line, then you withdraw. It was a reconnaissance in force. If it turns out to be so lightly numbered that you can take it with basically no casualties on either side because you overrun the position so quickly, then it's an assault. But it was still a reconnaissance in force. At this point, the troops which had been withdrawing to go and return to go to Chickamauga Station to head off to go to Knoxville get orders to return. Bragg can't afford them to go now. Longstreet's gone, by the way. These were further reinforcements he was sending after Longstreet. He's not upset about this. Bragg is quite happy about this. In some ways, you could argue that he's arranged a situation to give him a justification, because those two brigades are from up here. Unsurprisingly, they'll be heading for Chickamauga Station. In the centre at this point after this battle, Breckinridge finally orders his men to start fortifying the crest of Missionary Ridge. So this is starting on the 23rd of November. Okay, let's consider this the 23rd of November, and the operation started on September the 21st. Now, I can understand maybe the first part you don't do that, but maybe in October you'd have started? I think by now you're fortifying it about 8 weeks to 9 weeks too late. But you could justify it maybe up to about 6 weeks previously. But no more. Sorry, wearing a bow tie and a cardigan does not distract from his view that he does still think himself to be a guard dog. I'm not sure about it, but we'll leave that to one side. I'm not sure. Anyway, with their new command post and looking out, they now feel far more equipped to watch what's going on, watch what Bragg's doing, and they start organising their plans appropriately. Sherman, by this point, has 3 divisions ready to cross the Tennessee. They put the pontoon bridge at Brown's Ferry, had torn apart, but, they are starting to organise things so that they can cross in other places. Grant, at this point, decides, yeah, let's go for Lookout Mountain. Let's go for Lookout Mountain. And then we get the Battle of Lookout Mountain, and that's an interesting one from the get-go. Again, it's ordered as a demonstration. They're going to demonstrate and see what is there, what the Confederates have in store. There's only 2 problems with this as a plan. The first one is that the commander in overall charge of it is going to be Fighting Joe Hooker, who likes to fight. And the fact is, who he chooses as the brigade which is going to lead his demonstration. Brigadier General Geary, the guy who lost his son the other night. Yeah. I mean, this is definitely a recipe for a demonstration. This is definitely a recipe for we're going to distract the Confederates by presenting over here. We're not going to actually attack them. It is completely and utterly something which you can see as a solid example of a reconnaissance in force and a demonstration to distract you, not at all preparing for an assault, not by your selecting them. The orders received by Fighting Joe Hooker, are take the point only if the demonstration should develop its practicality. The orders he gives to Geary, a man who probably doesn't need such orders, but, we're going to give them a name. Cross Lookout Creek, assault Lookout Mountain, march down the valley and sweep every rebel from it. Oh, and by the way, behind you are going to be coming more forces who are going to reinforce you, so you will never not have reinforcement. You will never not have support. So he has a couple of brigades, or four other sort of corps, divisions, whatever you want to call them at this point. It really doesn't matter because all these forces are running into one another, even in the Union force. They were doing some demonstrations. But, yeah, Geary crosses the stream unopposed. He managed to get round without any trouble at all. He gets completely through. It's all fine. And he finds a defile. Those narrow gaps between the mountain and river that had not been secured because, you know, they've only had weeks, months to actually set up a proper picket system and get the lay of the land. And they hadn't. And Geary sweeps northeast along the base of Lookout Mountain. And he runs into Brigadier General Wolfell's brigade of Cheatham's division, which was at that point under the command of Brigadier General Jackson. And he outflanks Wolfell's brigade, outnumbers them, and sends them back to Crone's house, which is not on that map, but just below just below the north end of the mountain. They then run into Brigadier General Brown's brigade on top of the mountain. They were unable to intervene because the way the fighting was taking place below the cliffs, they couldn't get an angle on it. And as Geary starts to run into sections of skirmishes and sections of them, the divisions which have been grouped up behind him demonstrating, they start their attack. By 1500 hours, fog envelops the mountain, and Brigadier General Monterey C. Megas, Quartermaster General of the Union Army, who was watching this all from Knobb, coins the phrase "battle above the clouds" for the battle. Two sides were blazing away happily. They were far, now when we say blazing away, the reason that's used quite a lot is because people see, all they can see them is by the flashes, the blazes of their muskets and their rifles going off. And that's how you're trying to pick him up. Hooker is being his usual self. He's either sending messages to Grant of impending victory and desperate pleas for reinforcement. The Confederates evacuated that night. They realized that Bragg realized the battle was lost and abandoned it. Abandoned Lookout Mountain. And at this point, then, there is not even no siege. There is no potentiality of a siege. You sort of had something of a siege when you had Brown's Ferry and you had, these areas procured. But once you've lost control of Lookout Mountain, you've lost control of any ability to stop the Union literally bringing their river craft right up to Chattanooga itself. The river is navigable. They can do this. And on this night, there is probably the most consequential debate. Now, remember, this is a group which has spent weeks, nearly months, in this area, and they haven't fortified it a jot. They've literally started doing something the day before. Yeah, that's not going to work much, is it? And Bragg asks his two corps commanders, Breckinridge and Hardee, whether he should retreat or stand a fight. Hardee wanted to retreat. Breckinridge wanted to stand fast and fight it out from the strong position of Missionary Ridge. And Missionary Ridge could have been a strong position if you'd actually done anything to reinforce it. Anything at all. But the reality was they hadn't. They had not. And this is where we find ourselves with the Battle of Missionary Ridge. Once again, this is a battle which starts off with demonstrations. In fact, Grant's plan for the attack on 20 November is pretty much instructed Sherman to advance as soon as it's light in the morning, and your attack, which will be simultaneous, will be in the cooperation. This is which he's giving to Thomas, Your command will either carry the rifle pits and ridge directly in front of them, or move to the left, as the presence of the enemy may require. And he expects Hooker to do nothing other than diverting Bragg's attention by, acting around on the joy that is the plateau of Lookout Mountain. Thomas, knowing Hooker, if he wasn't given any plans, would probably go off and do something on his own anyway, decided he wanted support on his flank and asked Hooker to cross the valley and advance against Bragg's left flank directly on the at the Rossville Gap. The Rossville Gap is this point down here. You get into that, you get a very good position to start causing a lot of trouble. Sherman's supposed to be rolling up from up here. Sherman doesn't make much progress. Sherman launches multiple attacks. Some of them actually look like they're about to win, but he commits only 4 brigades to the attacks overall and makes no headway. It's kind of like Longstreet again. It's honestly like these fairly decent subordinates, once they're put in this area, suddenly go, what should probably have been committing his whole force and just steamrolling up the line. He's going, I'm committing 4 brigades. I'm committing this brigade to do this, and this brigade to do this, and this. I'm trying to make it complicated, and really it isn't the situation for complicated. It's the time for, we have the mass, steamroller them. If I'd been Sherman with the 3 divisions I had, I'd have probably put 1.5 divisions to try and force round the river and round back. 1 division, attacking from the front, and had the remaining half a division, extra brigades, grouped together as a personal juggernaut, which I was going to deploy the moment I saw a gap happening on either side and just pummel through. But I'm a naval historian, what do I know? I'm just looking at the ground, looking at it from maps and pictures people taken. That seems to be the only way to do it, and that seems to be the best way to do it. When you have got the preponderance of numbers, you have got the preponderance of artillery, you have got all these things, use them. Because speed will save lives. But instead he tries to be judicious. So at 1500 hours, Grant goes to Thomas, Sherman's not doing it. Go. And this is where Thomas really should have earned the most valued player of the match. I know Hooker gets jealous of Sherman's rewards afterwards, but I think the one who really deserves it is Thomas. To me, Thomas is the best player in this entire game. I know calling a battle a game seems wrong, but there is the fact that, when you're trying to give it as an assessment of groups and terminology, MVP does seem to go to Thomas in my mind. And Grant again tells Thomas to move forward in the center as a demonstration to help Sherman. The Army of the Cumberland advance. They push the Confederates from the rifle pits, but then they realize the Confederates on top of the ridge can fire down on them. And they were under fire from above. These were men who'd suffered taunts from Sherman's and Hooker's newly arrived troops, after being defeated at the Battle of Chickamauga, and they were being fired at from above with no plan of what to do. So the Union troops decide to continue attacking against the remaining lines. And once their commanders take up the attack, they start to seek shelter from the fire by going further up the slope. And as Bragg and places artillery and his troops and basically everything he could along the crest of the top of the ridge, the actual geographical crest, not the military crest, further down, which is of course further down the slope, but the actual geographical crest, they're unable to provide effective support to these troops down below. They're able to fire at them, but not able to effectively fire enough to support the Confederates down below. And the troops realise this. And so the Army of the Cumberland, without really any orders from anyone, starts advancing up the mountain. They advance up the mountain, and pretty much the Confederate troops can't really fire at them. So a forward attack, a frontal assault, that is, against entrenched defenders holding a high ground. This is the phraseology we use when we're talking about this sort of position. Should not work. There is no circumstance it should work. With no one coordinating it, it definitely shouldn't work. But actually, this time it does. Thanks in large part to the fact that the Confederates were not in what I would call entrenched positions above. They were in barely prepared positions. And waves upon waves, battalions upon battalions of troops just pour up the mountain. This is also the battle where Arthur MacArthur, Douglas MacArthur's father, makes his famous actions with flag and earns a Medal of Honor. Grant, unsurprisingly for someone who is a little bit of a control freak, was furious that his orders to advance as far as the rifle bits had not been followed, and threatened people generally if the assault failed. He'd been trying to be cautious with his troops, but that wasn't a good position to be cautious in. 90 minutes, about an hour later, after he's given that order, after Grant had given the order to move forward as a demonstration, the centre of Bragg's line breaks. They start to flee. And they're just retreating. They're heading towards Chickamauga Creek, towards the railway station, towards anywhere they can to try and get away. Hardee's command, up at the north, the one which has been holding up Sherman, are the only part of the line which doesn't have a panic flight. And they form the rear guard as it's retreated eastward. And then you learn the name of the probably MVP from the Confederate side, a Brigadier Claiborne, who pretty much, if it hadn't been for him at other points, it would have been very problematic. I would like to add that it's also unsurprising what's going on down here. Breckinridge was supposed to be in charge down south, but he was actually off wandering about his command. He was trying to be what he was but at 15:30 hours, when Thomas launched his demonstration, which turns into attack on Missionary Ridge, Hooker has been busily bridging Chattanooga Creek. And at the point at which Breckinridge starts ordering things to actually go into positions to defend against what Hooker's attack is going to be, when they realised that the gap is there, because apparently they hadn't realised the Rossville Gap was there, even they hadn't secured it, Hooker had already marched a division for it. And it's Hooker's formation which is coming up from the south, which really does for Bragg's troops, because they might have been able to draw and start organising themselves, but with the troops coming up from the south and the troops pouring in across the line, they're in no position to do so. They're in no position to organise it. It's a mess of a battle. It's a mess of a command structure. And yes, Claiborne again manages to pull the Confederate armies chestnuts out of the fire, thanks to an action he carries out at the Ringgold Gap. But the aftermath of the battle reveals the true details. It really does. The Union Army had lost 753 killed, 4,722 wounded, 349 missing. That's roughly just under 6,000 out of 56,000 in troops engaged. Bragg had 361 killed, 2,160 wounded, 4,146 missing, presumably prisoners. That's a little over 6,500 out of 44,000 troops. Please note, Grant's claim was he took 6,000 prisoners alone. So yeah, some losses could have been about 8,000, 8,500. They started off with smaller forces, they lost more troops. They lost more of artillery. This is their captured artillery. You can't afford to keep having this happen. And, as is quite normal in this scenario, immediately the Confederates start blaming each other. Breckinridge is relieved of command, accused of being drunk by Bragg. In fact, Bragg completely blames the Breckinridge and the cowardice of his army for the defeat, and resigns from the command of the Army of Tennessee in December 1st. To be replaced short-term by Hardee, and then eventually by Joseph E. Johnston. Honestly, that's not a bad change, but I'd have said Hardee could have done the job quite well myself. But the thing is, the politics of the Confederates mean that's never going to be the case. Longstreet's offensive, by the way, fell apart at the Battle of Fort Sanders in November 29th. And he was ordered to rejoin Bragg, and join the Army of the Tennessee, but he decided to, it was impractical, and so marched to Virginia. And his official was that he would march to Virginia when it was, at the moment the siege proved impractical. Which was not long, because Sherman with 25,000 troops turned up, and Sherman was back to form, whereas Longstreet still wasn't. And, a very few days later, basically December the 4th, Sherman arrives at Knoxville with 25,000 troops to go. Hello. They had won the Battle of Chickamauga against Rosecrans. And that's a great battle. But the trouble is for the Confederates is they actually brought all this on themselves. And their command structure hadn't held up to it. They hadn't taken advantage of what they'd won at Chickamauga. And just all in all, it's not a good time for them. It really isn't. This is one of those battles which was really interesting to me, because all the geography would seem to be on the side of the Confederates. And even launching a night attack. A night attack is a great way to level force numbers, if you're prepared to deploy the right forces, and do it right. There are so many wasted opportunities in this battle. Wasted opportunity by every level of the command structure. Which makes the loss of life worse. It means they chucked away good troops. Arguably they chucked away the second major army of the Confederacy on a situation which he could never win. Tied it down to a siege. Didn't act properly in the siege to crush the Union Army. So they just gave time to the Union to deploy their large resources, to deploy all their forces at their command, to deploy the senior officers at their charge. And let's be honest, if Rosecrans is broken, sending in Grant is as much about morale as it is actually having him in charge. Grant's arrived. Grant's here. Add in Hooker arriving with his forces, Sherman with his troops. They gave the advantage away. They gave everything away. Now, normally I do like to end my videos with a question, and so I want you to think about other battles I've discussed over the years and ones I haven't discussed on this channel. And think about times when commanders have given away the victory they've earned, where they've won something in a battle and then they have just thrown all the advantages away. There are lots of them in history. And it's a good lesson to think about when if you were ever a leader of a team, because if you win an advantage, if you win something, what happens next is as important as the victory. What you do with the victory, that's of value. That's of core importance. Thank you for watching, and I hope you've enjoyed. Take care, and hope you're enjoying the Christmas series of videos. Hopefully you are. Thank you.